Good morning, everybody. So as Charles said, today what I'll be speaking with you about is the racial and gender identities of millennials. So American millennials have been hailed as a bridge to a more racially diverse future, and they've also been cast as pushing the boundaries of gender with new forms of identity and expression. And today what I'm going to talk with you about is whether these characterizations are on the mark. So are millennials indeed embracing a more diverse and unconventional set of racial and gender identities? Are they also poised to challenge social norms around race and gender in other ways? So I'll start by digging into the racial backgrounds of millennials and how this shapes how they identify compared to previous generations. So US Census data shows that the share of Americans who identify as white alone has declined over time and also across generations, such that now there's slim majorities among millennials and the youngest Americans who identify as white alone. And statistics like those reported in this graph here, which is from a recent demographic report from the Brookings Institution, have fueled projections of the US soon becoming a majority-minority society. And be happy to talk more about that during the Q&A if people have questions about that possible future. And growing racial diversity in the US is a product of several major demographic changes from in the late 20th century. And these include the shifting of immigration streams from Europe to now from Asia and Latin America, and also increasing acceptance of intermarriage. And as a result of these changes, millennial Americans have lived and worked in more racially diverse neighborhoods, schools, and workplaces than in previous generations. And even the homes they grew up in were more diverse, such as more of their parents formed partnerships across conventional racial boundaries than any preceding generation. Now, during this time in the end of the 20th century and into the 21st, new forms of racial data collection also emerged. So the oldest millennials were just becoming adults in 1997 when the US Office of Management and Budget announced that it was revising all federal data collection guidelines to allow Americans to mark one or more boxes when identifying their race. And previously, people just had to check one box. And in the 2000 census, which was the first census to allow this multiracial reporting, 2.4% of Americans checked more than one race ID box. So this means that unlike previous cohorts, when most millennials sent off their college applications or applied to their first jobs, they were not forced to choose just one race to describe themselves. And newer data collection beyond the census offers the ability to consider whether everyone who is aware that they have multiracial ancestry also self-identifies as multiracial. So here I'll be speaking about analyses we ran using unique data from the 2015 Pew survey of multiracial adults to illustrate generational differences in both multiracial ancestry awareness as well as multiracial identification. And this survey was the first nationally representative study to ask respondents not only to report their own race, but also the races of their parents, their grandparents, and also earlier ancestors, which means that basically we can have an expanded definition of who counts as multiracial. So using these data, we find that more than 27% of millennials are aware that they have ancestors of different races. This is compared to 22% of Gen X, 17% of boomers, and 10% of the silent generation. And this suggests that not only that millennials have more diverse family backgrounds than previous generations, but that also even the silent generation is more racially diverse than we can see with statistics on self-identification alone. So here we're seeing 10%, whereas in just the census check multiple boxes, 2.4% for the whole population in 2000. And more than half of millennials who report multiracial ancestry trace their mixed heritage just one or two generations back to their parents or grandparents, which is shown in the turquoise and teal bars on this graph. And previous generations are more likely to report that the racial mixing occurred 3 or more generations back in their family tree. And in previous research, my co-author Elias Saperstein found that Americans who have close relatives of different races are also more likely to choose multiple races for self-identification. And indeed, we find that the conversion of multiracial awareness to multiracial identity occurs more reliably among millennials than among previous generations. So among Gen Xers, boomers, and members of the silent generation who are aware of having multiracial ancestry, fewer than 1 in 4 select multiple races for self-identification. So overall, about 1/4 of Americans are aware that they have multiracial ancestry, and among those, about 1/4 self-identify as multiracial. However, this share rises to about 1 in 3, or this 34% bar among millennials. So the conversion of awareness into identity also varies dramatically by the combinations of races reported in one's family tree, as shown in the chart on the right here. So for example, people with white and Asian ancestry, which is in the purple bars, are more likely to select multiple races for self-identification compared to people with either white and black or white and American Indian ancestry. And even among Americans with the same ancestry combinations, millennials are still more likely to self-identify as multiracial, with the clearest generational differences found for millennials with white and black ancestry, which is shown in the orange bars. So millennials thus stand out from older generations in two ways. First, they have more awareness of racial diversity in their ancestry, as we saw in the previous slide. And second, they have embraced new forms of data collection that not only tap into this awareness, but also allow for more diversity and self-identification than was possible in the past. Okay. So as with race, millennials also came of age at a time of rapidly shifting gender identity norms. And in particular, as the 20th century turned in the 21st, Americans increasingly questioned whether they should be limited to thinking about gender in static and binary terms. And suddenly in English, we had words like cisgender, transgender, non-binary, and genderqueer come into our language. In contrast to racial identification, though, social surveys and government data collection have been much slower to adapt to changing conceptions of gender. And this will not be news to anyone who was here for last year's State of the Union conference when Elias Saperstein presented about some similar data to what I'll be presenting today. But options to identify beyond female and male, or man and woman remain limited and were not generally available to millennials when they were applying to their first jobs or to college. However, when such options are included in surveys, they are embraced, and this is particularly so for millennials. So this spring, the General Social Survey became the first US nationally representative study to release data that includes both a person's sex at birth as well as their current gender identity, using the question wording on the top here. And in line with previous estimates, 1 in 150 Americans gave responses that could be classified as transgender or non-binary. And notably, only millennials chose non-binary gender identities, such as selecting transgender or writing in genderqueer in that categorical gender identification question. And transgender responses from previous generations were more likely to instead choose a binary gender that differed from their sex at birth, such as when a man says he was born female or a woman says she was born male. Of course, there's also diversity within gender categories for both cisgender and transgender people. And we've found that when respondents are offered separate scales to describe their femininity and masculinity, as shown in this third question on the slide, most do not fit within a traditional all or nothing model of gender identification, where there are two options that are distinct and opposite. Further, about 1 in 10 respondents in our national survey reported either seeing themselves as equally feminine and masculine or as gender nonconforming, such that they had lower scores on their gender typical scale than their gender atypical one. And that figure is more than 10 times the diversity that can be seen with these categorical gender questions alone. And we find that millennials embrace traditional gender identification on these gradational measures in particular. So here we highlight generational differences across 4 types of responses on that those feminine and masculine scales. So in the purple bars are people who described their gender in stereotypical and polarized terms, such that they were at the highest end of their gender typical scale and at the lowest end of their atypical one. In the gray bars are people who gave more tempered but still gender-conforming responses. So for example, women who identified as more feminine than masculine and men who identified as more masculine than feminine, but not necessarily completely polar. In green are people who see themselves as equally feminine and masculine, and in blue are people who gave gender non-conforming responses. So just as the media hype would have it, we find that millennials are least likely to identify themselves in strongly polarized terms and most likely to identify as equally feminine and masculine, or as gender nonconforming, with 14% of millennial respondents describing their gender in these more unconventional ways, compared to 6% of boomers and 8% of Gen Xers. And although large majorities in every generation still see themselves as conforming with traditional notions of gender, much like with race, increasing acceptance of gender diversity and new forms of data collection have also brought into view a more complex portrait of gender identity in America. Okay, so given that millennials are more willing to reject traditional gender and racial identities for themselves, some might expect that they're also more accepting of non-traditional gender roles and racial equality. So we wondered, are millennials innovators in both their personal identities as well as their social attitudes? So here we examine responses to two long-standing survey items on the General Social Survey. So on the left is responses to the question of whether it is better for everyone involved if the man is the achiever outside the home and the woman takes care of the home and family. And on the right is responses to a question about how people rate Black and white Americans when asked if people in this group tend to be hardworking or if they tend to be lazy. And here we see that millennials are more egalitarian than folks from the silent and greatest generations, yet they hold very similar attitudes to Gen Xers and Boomers. So we can see that the blue, green, and gray lines in both of these graphs are pretty similar. And 1/4 of millennials hold traditional inegalitarian views of gender roles, and 1/4 of millennials believe that Blacks are lazier than whites. This is similar to rates among Gen Xers and Boomers. And these trends are similar across a whole host of questions in addition to the two that we're showing you here. Now, this evidence of stability in attitudes masks some changes that are occurring. So more millennials endorse strongly egalitarian views than previous generations, and this is perhaps echoed in their visible roles in social movements such as Me Too and Black Lives Matter. However, the liberalizing trend is offset by the many millennials who maintain ambivalent or conservative views, so that on average, it appears little generational change has occurred on gender and racial attitudes since the baby boomers came of age. So, in summary, we've shown today that millennials are more likely than previous generations to identify as multiracial. They're also more likely to adopt unconventional gender identities, such as reporting that they see themselves as equally feminine and masculine. However, they're not outpacing previous generations in rejecting race and gender stereotypes. So these patterns leave us with something of a puzzle. And we wonder, as millennials begin to take on roles as workplace managers and national leaders, will they settle for just challenging race and gender labels, or will they further previous generations' efforts to promote racial and gender equality? And I will leave you with that question. Thank you.